Okay, so I don't know. Everybody reads the newspaper, right? So what we know from the news is everybody's always talking about the gut microbiota. Is your gut making you sick? Can we change our microbes to reduce heart disease? All of these things about weight and diet and the gut bacteria, and just so many news reports. I'm sure you've all seen them. About the microbiota, about your gut and health. So this is basically it. According to the newspapers, the microbiome is the key to our health, but actually things aren't that straightforward. They never are. So these are headlines that we have to take with a pinch of salt. But what we need to know first is, what is the gut microbiota? So what it means is the ecological community of the microorganisms that share our body space. So this is when it's talking about bacteria and viruses and some fungi that are good for us, that live on our body surfaces. So this is exactly what I've just said. So we have all of these healthy, friendly microorganisms that live on our body. And you have to think of us like a rainforest, that we are colonized with different animals, that we kind of walking around as a very complex micro environment. But actually what's really interesting is, I read this a lot, which makes me laugh, is that we're actually more bacteria than human. Within our bodies, our bacterial cells outnumber our cells 10 to 1. So we're carrying around a lot of cargo, if you think about it like that. And when we think about the bacteria on our body spaces, they're mainly in places that are open to the air. So on our skin, in our mouths, down the gastrointestinal tract, so in our stomach and our intestines. And that is the bacteria that I'm interested in looking at, in the bacteria that lives in our in our intestines, because that's where most of the bacteria are. And we can do research. Everybody thinks about being a research scientist as being quite glamorous, but I'm telling you it's not. Most of the research I do is with human poo, because out of the poo comes the bacteria that we look at. And what we do is we compare how that bacteria in the poo is different between people who have inflammatory diseases and also then people who don't have these diseases. So I talked about all these kind of press headlines, but what do we actually know about the gut microbiota and inflammatory diseases? And this is where you have to start considering that some of the things that we read are not as concrete as they say. But what we do know is that the gut microbiota, so this is the bacteria that lives in your gut, is different in people who have inflammatory diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease and diabetes. And we also know that changing your diet and taking things like antibiotics changes your gut microbiota. And the reason why changing your diet affects your gut microbiota is because it has different things to eat. So different food makes different bacteria. It helps different bacterial colonies live. So we're here today to ask about uveitis, but actually very few studies have been done in patients with uveitis, both in the adult field and also with young people who develop diseases. But we do know that diseases that are associated with an increased risk of developing uveitis, so in young people who have juvenile idiopathic arthritis, that they have different gut bacteria compared to young people who do not have juvenile idiopathic arthritis. And through Great Ormond Street Hospital, with the rheumatology team, so these are the people who look after the young people with arthritis, we did one of those studies, and that's the platform that we'll be using, hopefully, depending on funding and everything, to be doing in our uveitis cohort. And that's what I'm going to explain to you just now. Oh yeah, I said that. Just a couple of questions, because I know I speak fast, and also because this is new information. So anything not clear, everybody understand what the, yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, hello, thank you. Oh, yes, okay, yeah. No, so what we know is that so many of the changes that we see across inflammatory diseases are quite similar. So you see this loss of diversity in the gut microbiota, which you see in many different diseases. So we couldn't look at the poo and say this person has JIA, but we could look at the poo potentially and say this person has an inflammatory disease. But you have to be careful, because some people who don't have inflammatory diseases have less diverse microbiotas. So it's one of these areas where it's not black and white. There's a kind of spectrum of what the bacteria looks like. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes? So I don't work on that. What I work on is trying to understand why the bacteria in your gut may affect the different function of immune cells. But this, we are starting through new studies to collaborate with dietitians, and those will be the people who will be best placed to do that work. Whereas I'm more interested in the mechanisms of why something goes wrong. So I'm just going to move on, but then just to keep things going, but there are more time for questions later. So our previous study in Great Ormond Street Hospital. So we had a particular research question, which we will soon hopefully be asking uveitis, which is the bacteria in the gut different in children with arthritis compared to children who do not have arthritis? And we were also interested in seeing whether or not children who, they're brothers and sisters, so they live in the same household, they don't have arthritis. If they, but you're sharing the bacteria. It's you're sharing it. Everybody's got quite similar bacteria in the house. Whether or not siblings who were similar ages had different microbiota compared to their siblings with arthritis. But actually, in the end, we didn't get many samples from our siblings, so we couldn't really ask that question. But I do think that that's key as we build up numbers in this space. And then we also, within the study, we asked questions about nutrition, about the diet, because this is really kind of linked to what the bacteria looks like. And we also asked questions about early life, because there is some research suggesting that early life to do with different modes of birth, breastfeeding, diet, going to school, having pets can affect your microbiota. So what we asked is whether or not people would give stool or poo to our study, and we also asked whether or not they would give blood, because I'm interested in the immune system, so to try and understand whether these differences in the gut microbiota are associated with differences in the blood, in our white blood cells. And we also asked, I said this, about diet and medication, and then we sent them home with a kit to collect their poo. And this, some people didn't really mind it, other people did mind it so much. Parents who had children in nappies, it was very easy for them, but we asked people up to the age of 16, 17, so some of the teenagers didn't like it so much. But what you have to do is you put a stool catcher on the toilet, then you go to toilet in this catcher, and then we scoop a little bit of the poo. We do not need a full tube's worth, I'm telling you that now. We only need a pea-sized amount, because that gives us enough information about the bacteria. And then we asked them to box it up and wrap it up, and then they sent it in Royal Mail, first-class delivery, to me, which actually, funnily, sometimes people got my post by accident. I'm sure you can imagine they weren't that pleased about that. So this is quite a standard technique now that's used in many studies with people with inflammatory disease. So yes, post it. I bet luckily the postman didn't know what was in the post. So I don't know if this will work. Oh yeah, so the information that we got is all the different kinds of bacteria that's in your poo. So you have to think about the fact that you have different kinds of bacteria in different parts of the intestine, but we looked at the poo bacteria. And what these colors represent is, in the bar chart, is the different kinds of bacteria that we had from a different patient. So that's the information that I'm interested in. And the reason why I'm showing you into a wave, because you have to think that these are different kinds of bacteria, but they live within the gut. So when they're in the gut, they're not in this bar chart, they're all living together in a community. And we are interested in that community. And this is just to show data from 2 different patients, so you can see those communities within the gut are quite different between 2 different patients. So what did we find? I think this is what is very interesting, and it's lovely to have someone in the study here, because we hope to publish this in the next year and then share the data more widely. But we managed to recruit 68 people with arthritis, young people with arthritis, and 38 age-matched controls. What was interesting for us is actually it was much harder to recruit control poo, because people are busy. They say that they would do it, but then they wouldn't, whereas people who are in the clinic were very invested in providing us with the samples. So we thank the patients very much for their contribution to the study. And actually, what was really interesting, the biggest driver of differences was age, not disease. So if you were 16, you had a much more different microbiome to a 3-year-old, and that was not as different as a 3-year-old with arthritis versus a 3-year-old without arthritis. But we also found, so we had patients who had active joint inflammation. So if we do this in uveitis, you'd have active eye inflammation or you wouldn't. And we saw that if you had active inflammation in your joints, you had more differences to a healthy child than if you didn't have inactive disease. So that suggests that some of the inflammation, so something's happening that's affecting the bacteria in your gut, or vice versa. And what was really interesting is, because I'm interested in how the bacteria communicates with your immune system, is what we found is that patients with active joint inflammations particularly had a difference in the ability of their gut microbiota to break down parts of the diet. So say you're eating, I don't know, pasta or a burger or, I don't know, Haribo, your bacteria in your gut can get different, what we call like metabolites, which are molecules from it, which communicate with your immune system. And we found that that was different in patients who had active joint inflammation compared to children who didn't have joint inflammation at that time. So we're really interested to see if we see similar differences in people who then have uveitis. Oh yeah, so JIA is associated with the development of uveitis, but we didn't have enough numbers. So it's really important in scientific studies that you have lots of people in order to make these grand statements in the press, and often there isn't enough people. So we did have some patients that had uveitis in the study, but when we do the analysis, we can't find any differences, but we think that's because we didn't have enough people, basically. So we're interested in building on this as we move forward. Any questions? So, oh yeah. Oh yes, it's a good. So Choir, which will be in the newsletter, I believe. Yes, is a new bioresource led by Lola, which will be taking, we hope, blood and in surgery, sometimes eye tissue if people are going under anesthetic anyway. And also this will be the ethics, which we're recruiting the poo from. So and we haven't got it all through yet, but in the next few months, we hope to start recruiting, and you'll be hopefully seeing one of our research assistants in the clinic or helping. Yeah. So this is a really big new thing, and this is what Lola and I have been working on for 2 years, a year. Yeah. So it's very exciting for us to kind of nearly be at the point where we're going to be able to start recruiting poo and other things from the patients and yourselves in the clinic here. So what are the uveitis frequently asked questions? So prebiotics and probiotics, things that they have bacteria and they feed the bacteria in our gut. People ask whether or not if you take these, it will prevent uveitis. People ask whether or not changing the diet will help. Can we also use these prebiotics and these probiotics to treat disease? And also whether or not taking antibiotics can affect disease. But we have to be really careful at saying anything at this stage, because we don't know the answers. As I said, there haven't been that many studies. Also, it's a very complex system, because changing your diet does change your microbiota, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to affect disease. So that's why we need to do these big studies. The research, really, this field has only been around properly for 10 years, which is very young in scientific research. So we think that there will be ways that we can change the microbiota, which may help some patients, but we don't know that yet. And we're really early on in the studies. And that's why it's really important that we do this research so we can gain more information and then hopefully tell you in 5 to 10 years' time. But, you have to think, if somebody tells you, I don't know, that eating something particular is going to help your disease, that's not necessarily true. But we do know that having a healthy diet is good for your health in general. And this is very readily available information. And the dietitians, regardless of whether you have disease, will tell you that, this classic healthy diet, many plants, not too much fat, not too many sweets, but, we all need some sweets occasionally. Just everybody will tell you that. So it is something to consider. But in the context, we don't have any evidence to suggest that will help inflammation, but it is good for you. So, yeah, and then thanks to Dr. Lola, the consortium part of the arthritis, and then also, yes, look out for Choir, and just have to thank the funders who help us, and all of the patients and everybody who makes the research possible. So, yeah.
So as Lizzy said, even though we don't have the firm evidence, we do know on a population level that ultra high processed foods and processed foods that are high in sugar are bad for a whole host of inflammatory disorders. So we can say that with pretty good certainty for everyone, irrespective of whether or not you have uveitis. There's a Q&A, and the Q&A is, if you look at uveitis in the gut, How would that work with young people on adalimumab, methotrexate? My son's diet is pretty poor after injections. We hear you, and I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience who have experiences of lifestyle changes after they start their treatment, either because of treatment or because of the whole stress of the disease pathway. That's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to get a large number of children in these studies, so that we can look at those children who have uveitis and are on adalimumab, have uveitis and aren't on adalimumab, so those factors can be corrected for, so we can understand what really are the drivers of the changes that we see. Because, Unicorn's guest, we're not entirely sure what that answer is going to be. We can only get to that answer if we have the information that Lizzy and I and Harry are hoping to collect from clinic and the children that we see. So I'll move that from Answer Live.